But the teacher as making that remark in the sense of reconstructing a very precious, even sacred moment between the teacher-disciple relationship. So in this sense, I think we can still underscore the importance of the dialogical mode in the Analects. But Mencius is very different. And Mencius, there's a discursive quality, there's a narrative, stories, anecdotes, even prose. There's a certain kind of narrative structure. And you can think about Mencius as something that is authored by one person, so there's an authorial voice. And many scholars in China, especially in literature, consider Mencius as eloquent, sometimes argumentative, but eloquent. But this is one of my favorite texts. I don't know your own reaction to it. I find this text is a text about hope, about promise, about moral idealism. But moral idealism not simply imagined in the privacy of one's own study or one's own environment. But its idealism grew out of a very realistic understanding of the brute facts, the brutal reality of the world. Mencius, of course, in the 3rd century lived in a period, normally we characterize it as the warring states. The international warfare, confrontation, disintegration of not only states, but communities, families. Real violence, not only in the political arena, but in family. Conflicts among brothers, siblings. All kinds of unavoidable, sometimes tragic events that became sort of a daily occurrence. And it is in this particular context that Mencius presented, based upon his realistic understanding of the situation, a kind of moral idealism. He also presented an overall plan, whether it will work or not, overall plan of not just human survival, but hopefully human flourishing, to improve the state of the world. And of course, he argues quite forcefully that we have to go through the process of building political leadership. And building up political leadership involves the participation, hopefully large participation, active involvement of engaged scholars. So his own mission is try to train a group of engaged scholars that will be able to improve the state of the world through the kind of moral idealism based upon a rather realistic understanding of the unfortunate situation of the world. And of course, it is important to work through the government, through the power elite. Hopefully, the change of the power elite will then gradually become the source of a transformation. And that, like Confucius, he met with all kinds of frustrations. So you can say he also failed. But failed not because he was not able to become prominent in terms of the rules of the game of the time, but because he refused to change not only his outlook of life, his worldview, but also his moral idealism. He's not going to compromise. And because he refused to compromise, he necessarily failed. And it is in that failure that a new possibility opened up. Not necessarily directly transforming the world from the governmental structure of the power elite, but through communal building and even through personal education. It is in this sense that we like to examine some of the underlying assumptions. Mencius certainly was absolutely serious about these underlying assumptions. And on the surface, they are rather simplistic, if not simple-minded. But these underlying assumptions worked out in a kind of holistic vision about the human project, and with very realistic understanding of how it could be accomplished. The first assumption, often considered as naive, but I think in our discussion we'll be able to see some of the subtle dimensions involved in this process. This Mencius advocates the goodness of human nature. Human nature is good. Actually, the pervasive view of the time was that human nature is what we are born with. In the modern scientific sense, our biological, physiological, and neurological givens at birth constitute what human nature is. So we are what we are born with. It's a kind of neutral, scientific, if not factual point of view. That was very widely accepted. So you can say human nature is good, human nature is bad, human nature is oriented to a social participation, human nature can be aggressive towards nature. You can have all kinds of possibilities, like what we do today. But Mencius asked, as many great scholars in the world ask the question, what are the defining characteristics of being human? Those unique features that we want to honor, we want to underscore, we want to understand in terms of our nature. Of course, from the Greek point of view, humans are rational animals. So the importance of human rationality, not that we don't have passions, we don't have other things that are totally irrational. But to say the human being is a rational animal is to say rationality is a distinctive feature of being human. And some people, anthropologists for example, will say human beings are tool users. We know how to use tools. Many other animals are not able to do that. And people who are now interested in what we call symbolic interchange will say, well, human beings are linguistic animals. We can speak. The ability to express ourselves in words, in symbols, becomes really critical for defining who we are. But I think from the Mencius point of view, human beings could be understood as self-actualizing beings. We develop ourselves. And these self-actualizing beings is really related to the notion that we are able to realize our potentialities. To realize our potentialities, this is something rather distinctive. We make ourselves. Now that's the reason why the importance of the learning to be human. Now for all the animals, they all learn to be a horse, to be a dog, to be a cat, but self-consciously trying to develop ourselves. That sense of learning to be human is rather unique. So you can say the realization of the full potentials of being human. That is considered distinctive, different from the idea of the rational animal, the idea of the tool user, or the idea of the linguistic. You know, our linguistic capacities or abilities define who we are. But nowadays, when we look at this claim that self-actualizing animal trying to realize our potentiality can be a rather pluralistic view. In other words, we know, like one of our distinguished colleagues, Howard Gardner, talk about multiple intelligences. Human beings are some strong in artistic expressions, some strong in music, mathematics, geographic, or geometric, some in sports, some in space. There are multiple intelligences. So which one you honor to consider that distinctively human? The Mencius choice, or the Confucian choice as a whole, is very clear. It's the moral. The moral self-actualization, the moral qualities that can be fully realized. And I don't want to go into the argument now, but simply to mention in passing that all the other forms of intelligences are important. All other forms of intelligence, such as artistic, musical, mathematical, and so forth. But one type of intelligence, so one type of human quality that is non-negotiable in the sense that every human being will have to be tried to develop. Some of us are not artistic. For myself, I'm not musical in the sense that I would be able to play a good instrument. That's fine. We're not considered, I'm not very sporty, or I'm not strong in mathematical competences, so fine. But one type of quality, that is the moral, which will have to be present for all human beings. I say, well, I'm too artistic to be moral. I'm too scientific or mathematical to be moral. I'm too spatial oriented to be moral. None of these statements would be accepted. So the notion that to be moral in this sense is a universal claim. It is in this sense that the whole Mention project, like the earlier Confucian project, is focused on the development of the person through self-effort, through the effort of the person himself or herself, therefore the question of self-cultivation. Now, it's very controversial. It's a controversial point. Some scholars believe that Mencius' notion about self-cultivation is a discovery model. Because we are intrinsically good, therefore we discover the good qualities in our nature for our growth. It is not a development model. It's not the acquisition of some things from the outside. It's just internal discovery. Discovery the goodness within. But I think that's probably wrong. We really have to think both in terms of discovery and development. Why? It's complicated. Why we are naturally good and yet we have to cultivate ourselves. That's a very, very interesting issue. But the emphasis is on self-effort, the effort of oneself for that process, which is both a discovery to try to understand the internal resources that we originally all have, and at the same time to develop them, to allow them to flourish. And it's both a discovery and a development model, and one will have to be in charge. It is not something that anyone else will be able to do for you. So it's very, very much in the spirit of the idea of the learning for the sake of oneself, not for the sake of others, or for social approval because of the injunctions from parents or from other social forces. But since the person is always central relationships, this process of self-cultivation, which is both a development model and a discovery model, is what I call a communal act. It's not an individualistic act. It's not something that one does simply as an isolated individual. That's the reason why self-cultivation is always understood in terms of human relationships. Even in the privacy of your home, when you think about that, you're still in the community of the like-minded. And it is in this sense then, self-cultivation is related to a notion of public spiritness. Always move beyond the domain in which we find ourselves. I think very early I mentioned the whole style of moral reasoning begins with a concrete living person here and now, just right here and now. That's the point of departure. But that point of departure is to have a sense of rootedness, a sense of there are resources we'll be able to tap. That sense of rootedness is never used as as a pretext, as an excuse for self-enclosure, because the relationships forces one almost like you have to have windows. In the room you have to have windows, you have doors, you have to walk out, you have to let the sun shine in. So you're always in that sense of being in communication. And it is in this sense then self-cultivation, it's not a psychological act. So Finger Red in a way is right to say it's not psychologistic. But there is inner self, there's a question of the inner self. If I get a chance to explore that, I think maybe next week sometime, I will link the deepening self-awareness with the broadening of self-relationship, which is highly complex, on the other hand, in terms of praxis, but in terms of conceptual understanding, very easy to grasp. In this sense of the communal act, the community is implicit in the personal quest for self-realization. But realistically, Mencius believed that those who are in power, who have influence, who are in control, ought to be the target of the education, so the transformation of the world will begin with those people who are in leadership position. And therefore, the focus, sometimes is against overwhelming odds, how to transform these powerful figures, political figures, they're in power, they're in control, into benevolent rulers. How can you do that? I think if you read Mencius, the very beginning of Mencius is trying to advise the kings to be humane. And kings were not particularly interested in those issues, they're interested in wealth and power. So there's always this mismatch. And actually, I'll give you an anecdote, a Confucian, later he became a legalist. A Confucian tried to persuade the king about rightness and humanity, very much following the Confucian line. And after about 20 minutes, the king fell asleep. And so he changed his mind. He said, really, what I'm interested in is wealth and power. The king woke up and they talked for 6 hours. And eventually the king asked him to be a chief advisor and a prime minister. Sang Yang, it's a very interesting story. But then, of course, he helped the Qin dynasty become very strong. But it lasted for only about 17 years. When it disintegrated, he also sacrificed, his life also was lost in the process of power struggle. So the Confucian said, okay, he got it. He got the audience of the king, he set up a very powerful legalistic system, but it didn't last very long. Now for Mencius, he's very, very clear what his position was. He's not going to compromise, and yet he knew that he had to communicate with these people. If they are receptive, he would like to do that. He's trying to appeal in a very strange way. There's one very beautiful anecdote, and some people consider it naive, but I take that very seriously. He tried to appeal to the heart that cannot bear the suffering of others. The heart that cannot bear the suffering of others is considered as the root of humanity. It's the tender-minded side of the human rather than the tough-minded way. And there's a focus on the human factor. And this is a strong belief that the kind of rule, either you call it rule by virtue or rule by law, contrasted with rule by law, the emphasis on how it's possible to develop a rule by virtue as a minimum requirement for the benevolent government. And of course, on the surface, he was not able to do it. He was not successful. But he couldn't but do it in the sense that he wanted, if the political structure is not going to be changed, he tried to do that. It doesn't mean that the whole cause is lost. Because in trying to do that, he was trying to develop a new community, or the community of the like-minded. Not just his students, but those people, the ministers and others. He wanted the argument to be present as an alternative, as an alternative vision. Even though the situation as it is can never become totally transformed into what it ought to be, according to this rather moralistic idea. But the effort itself is going to lead some preliminary change. So in the book of Mencius, there are 4 major distinctions that Mencius considered critical for us to understand the human condition. First is the distinction that you have to ask. I think continuously Mencius asked the question, what is the difference between human beings and other members of the animal kingdom? The uniqueness of being human. You have to ask that question. If moral development is unique, it's not simply rational calculation, it's not simply the linguistic tool, what is the basis for that hope that human beings are capable? There's one example, one demonstration. It is not proof. It's only a demonstration. It's the famous demonstration of seeing a child is about to fall into the well. You try to save the child from falling into the well. Read that case very carefully. The context is very important. Even today, which means we are desensitized. We've lost this sensitivity of humanity or human fellow feelings. We are very desensitized. We're not able to do much, and we're paralyzed in terms of our sensitivity. And yet, when we see a tragedy is happening, and there's a sense of shock, and a sense of uneasiness, the child is about to fall into the well, so we try to save the child. It's not the action itself that proves that we're capable of reforming ourselves, but simply the sense of shock. Suddenly you see, any kind of traffic accident or anything, you feel uneasy. That uneasiness, from the Mensch's point of view, is our saving grace. We still are capable of being shocked, or being, in a way, being able to respond to a situation with the feeling of not bearing the suffering of others. Of course, if we're conditioned, we may not be able to do anything. We're conditioned not to be actively involved. But the shocking realization itself, from the Mensch's point of view, is unique. And it is a promise. It is a possibility. The art is to focus. We have a more elaborate argument for this, is to focus on that small difference. Now with all the genetic coding and so forth, we know how little difference human beings are from many other animals. The little difference, that is what we should focus our attention on. That little difference, we say the full distinctiveness of our being human, that little difference, we need to preserve it. And we need to allow it to grow. We need to eventually allow it to be extended, to be expanded. And that unique difference is what Mencius would call Xing, heart. We can, the word Xing in Mencius should be rendered, both as heart and mind. In Chinese, or for that matter in Japanese or Korean, there's no distinction between the mind, which is the cognitive, knowing faculty, and heart, which is the affective, feeling aspect of the heart. So the heart and mind, the Xing, sometimes people prefer to render it as a heart, and some people prefer to render it as mind, like I. Richards called Mencius on the mind, but D.C. Lau always renders it as heart. And we don't have to make up our mind what to do, but I think it's much better for us simply to recognize as heart and mind, those affective and at the same time cognitive. And this Mencius is considered as innate. And of course, the question is the sense of sympathy, our ability to be sympathetic to something else, is that an innate quality, or it is also learned? We know rational calculation has to be learned. We need to cultivate that and gradually. But is sympathy is something that we also learn? Is empathy something also learned? Or Mencius will show, even in a totally paralyzed situation, we're still capable of responding to a particular phenomenon outside. That shows that we still have that innate capacity. So it is internal. We need to, so the first question Mencius wanted to ask is the distinction between what is unique in terms of the human condition. And then he focuses attention on the heart and mind. The second distinction he wanted to make is the difference between cultured and uncultured. What is a civilization that is considered cultured? It's the exercise of the soft power against coercion. Cultured, which means civil, it's related to ritual and civility, has a sense of orderliness. a sense of sustainability. It's a long-term sustainability. And any kind of cultured society will have a sense of distributive justice, allowing the majority of the people to take part in the process. The socializing process is not restricted to the elite vis-a-vis the masses. There must be a continuous participation of an ever-extending network of human relationships into that particular process. It is not simply a society governed by law and regulations. It is society governed by shared orientations or shared values, and there must be some sense of harmony based upon both horizontal and vertical communication. And in other words, a society comes into being not simply because interests or profit, but because of some sense of rightness. It is not the calculation of the benefit that we decide to form society. It is the natural growth of not just human survival, but human flourishing. All the major institutions, such as the family, such as the school, such as community compact systems or the voluntary associations, all come into being not through the contract. It's not a contractual. It's almost like an unstated covenant. I'm part of that on the surface without choice, but at the same time, my participation in that process is because I think it's right. So the notion about calculating interest, maximizing profit, and also competitiveness based upon contractual relationships are not totally eradicated to the background as things that are not necessarily the most important ingredients for the development of a society. So the distinction between rightness and profit. If we always think about interest and profit and competitiveness without a sense of rightness, the appropriate way of doing that, that distinction is so critical that a moral community will never come into being. So then the right politics. We need to differentiate between right politics and the politics as simply a mechanism of control. Politics is not simply a mechanism of control, it's the hegemonic power. The hegemonic power is to use the various kinds of moral ideas, such as humanity and rightness, as a pretext for a certain kind of political control. But the right politics, the king, the way of kingship, is based upon moral influence. The moral influence is often understood as the values that I cherish or we cherish gradually will be accepted by other people. So it's a shareability, to share with other people. The more we be able to share, the more we'll be able to extend our influence. In this context, the mentioned Confucians put a great deal of emphasis on the training of political leadership. The training of political leadership is first based upon the ability to have the correct worldview against two kinds of extremism. One is universal, we call it universal, abstract universalism. The Mohists. Mencius was involved in the debate with the Mohists, with emphasis on universal love, on non-differentiation, on love without differentiation or distinction. On the surface, it seems to be against a kind of egalitarian principle, the Mencian line. That is, we have to make a distinction between those who are very close to us, like our relatives. We also need to care for the people. We need to take care of nature. But all these things have to be understood in a differentiated mode, not in a totally universalized manner. If you demand that everyone should cultivate universal love in such a way that the distinctions are relegated to the background, then your treatment of your parents will be just as indifferent as you treat a stranger. So you need to have a highly differentiated love to try to understand how your sympathetic feelings actually work in a concrete context. You can imagine this argument in terms of a kind of hydraulic model. The water will flow unless the water table is high enough to allow it to flow. If a person is not prepared, if the person is not able to feel sympathetically towards a much larger environment than simply the family, and you force the person to love someone who's not related at all as intensely as parents or as the closest people around, the person will not be able to do it. Now, this realistic principle, we call it principle of particularity, is against another extreme. The other extreme is particularism. Particularism based upon self-centeredness. You can say it egoism. First against universalism, and then you have to fight against egoism. Egoism is self-enclosed, self-centeredness, a kind of selfishness. So the realistic principle is to say each person will have to exercise the art of extension. The extension can be very limited. You can only extend to another person, maybe to 2 or 3 other persons. But you need to extend, because the dynamic process will eventually lead to a much better humane world. If you don't extend, then you suffer from the kind of egoism which eventually will be detrimental for any form of human flourishing. Now let me put this in the proper context. You have the series of concentric circles, right? Moving out. And at the core, and you have to have a realistic appreciation of where you stand. If you cannot, for example, at the core is the person, an individual, any one of us, then the family, maybe a larger community, nation, and the world. And a person at this particular juncture, we ask ourselves, can I feel sympathetically linked to other people? If the question is, I cannot at all, I can only relate meaningfully to myself, I'm not at all capable of extending my sympathy to anyone else. That, from the Confucian point of view, is not necessarily a disvalue. It can be a value. In what sense it's a value? I'm very self-centered, I'm very selfish, but the important thing is that I do not inflict any damage or any pain to anyone else. I try to be self-sufficient. I just try to be myself. I try to do the things that I consider most meaningful to me. So it's not a disvalue, it's a value, but the value is limited. Self-reliance is fine. So then you ask the question, maybe a couple of other people that I still feel comfortable with, a friend or a relative, and then the person's value is added. It's added value to 2 or 3 other people. And then someone said, no, I can't go beyond my self-centeredness. And in fact, I can develop certain kind of public spiritedness towards my family, a family of 4 or 5. I can have, even some sense of self-sacrifice is fine. This small coterie of people, I really care. I don't care for the others. Normally we suffer from, say, nepotism or family attachments. But that is an added value. It's much better than self-centeredness or egoism. But certainly if we only remain in that domain, we can only relate meaningfully to the closest members of our community, which is only in this area. We cannot extend. If we become also, we develop not only indifference, but some hostility towards the larger world, and only want to protect our family, then of course that could become a degenerative moral idea. You know, so that's the reason why I said don't confuse Confucian ethics with mafia ethics. The too much concern about the family to the extent that the outside world becomes a hostile environment can turn out to be extremely detrimental. However, I care for my family, but I don't care for others. That notion itself is not necessarily not a positive value, depending on how you do it. But beyond the family, you'll be able to extend to a village or to a larger world and so forth. That extension becomes the actual process of making the world more humane. It is not the abstract idea. It is not the extreme particularism. But Mencius added one more. That is the meaning of political leadership, the middle path. That is those people who are in power, those people who have access to information, idea, goods, resources, do not have the choice of an ordinary person who has no power. An ordinary person, if the person is a victim, the person can take care of himself, then as a victim, he's fulfilled the responsibility being a respectable member of the community. But if the person is not a victim, the person is actually in control, then the person is obligated to extend wider. Because if it doesn't extend wider, he would necessarily be confined and constricted, and that would be very detrimental to the world. So in a subtle way, you don't simply put humanity into practice. You know, you don't do that in an instrumental way. What you do is to work from humanity. It's not to put humanity or rightness into practice, but you work from humanity and rightness, flow from within. And that is the proper way. Now, another very significant definition of leadership in this connection is the Mencius notion that the most important thing for the leaders to take care of is the well-being of the people. It's not democratic in our modern sense, but it's a kind of populism, nurturing the people. So I may challenge you to find any incident in Mencius that is not on the side of the people, but on the side of the ruler. I think it's very difficult for you to find any example. There's one ruler, he complained bitterly. He said, look, these people are not good. When there was famine, I moved food to the area, I moved people out of it. I tried to take care of my people. And yet, when there was a confrontation with a neighboring country, all my new tenants died, but people just ran away. They betrayed me. I tried to take care of them, but they betrayed me. Mencius said, well, you're interested in warfare. Let me give you an example. When there's confrontation, that everybody run. Some people run 100 paces. Some people run 50 paces. Those people who run away 50 paces laugh at those who run 100 paces. Wow, you're cowards. Is that right? King said, no, everybody's running. They're all cowards. He said, all of you are cruel. All of you are detrimental to society. All of you are brutal towards your people. Use them for all kinds of purposes. Some use it in an extreme. Some use it in a more modest way. You're one of them. Of course, it's simply right for the people to run away. If they do not run away, they don't have any basic intelligence. In this sense, then, the leadership has to be responsive, not just being responsible for the well-being of the people, but responsive to the demands, to the ideas, to the feelings of the people. It is not, you really have to, the notion about responsiveness is to be able to understand, in other words, another form of extending this sense of sympathy. Not only to help, as treating people simply as objects, but to help them in the sense to try to understand their sentiments, their feelings, to share the emotions, to try to appreciate what the people really wanted. And the leaders then must be exemplary teachers. Not teaching by words, but also teaching by example. There's a tacit dimension in that process, because the leader themselves will have, as teachers, will have to learn to be students themselves. They should not set themselves up as models. They should try to encourage the people to develop their well-being. In other words, the idea of the livelihood of the people becomes the central concern. They should try to enable the people to develop their own capacities. It's a capacity building. Leadership is a capacity building for the people. So the people will be able to maintain their livelihood, and the leader then, through inspirational examples, will be able to lead the people through certain kind of moral influence. So politicians ought to learn to be teachers, even though teachers may not necessarily want to be politicians. Now, Mencius then realized his own, actually managed to find his own niche in the society. His niche is not simply to become an integral part of this political elite. His niche is to develop a structure in which the engaged scholar, the intellectual, will be able to articulate the concerns of the people in order to coerce, morally coerce the leaders to comply to some of the basic models of leadership. Now that process of developing a totally different structure within the society, the scholars, as engaged scholars, interested in politics, therefore very directly involved in the political structure, but remain independent. This created a new role for the intellectual. Many people believe that the whole book of Mencius could be read as a defense of this group of people. They didn't farm. They didn't do any work, not as artisans, and they did not exchange any goods like merchants. So they're not productive members of the society, and yet they need to be respected, they need to be heard, and they have a tremendous function to play within the society. How could that be? Why should a group of people that are not producers of the society, of course in the modernistic sense it's very easy for us to appreciate it, but in that early period, Mencius already developed a rather sophisticated notion about the division of labor. The intellectuals, in this sense, as representatives of the sentiments and feelings and concerns of the people, will be able to argue on behalf of the people in reference to the political leadership. And this is the meaning, from their point of view, this is the meaning of the life of the mind. It's not life of the mind as philosophers, as prophets, as people who try to think. And thinking becomes certain kind of luxury. But here, because of the participation in that political process, their work of the life of the mind becomes essential for understanding how the society actually worked. Why should a group of people who labor with their minds, didn't labor with their muscle, didn't produce anything, be not only respected, but taken absolutely seriously? Now, in the book of Mencius, then, you find numerous examples that these people exercise, I would call it, spirit of protest. These people continue to criticize the political situation, especially criticize the kings, in order to make sure they became more responsive to the demands of the people. And in one of the most recently unearthed texts, one of Mencius' teachers, the grandson of Confucius, by the name of Zi, he was asked, what is a royal minister, by one of the kings. And the response was, a royal minister, a truly royal minister, is someone who continues to criticize the defects of the king. And the emperor, the king at the time, was a bit surprised. Just a critic, no constructive ideas. So he asked one of his ministers, is this right? Is criticism the most important feature of being an intellectual, being an engaged intellectual? The response to that particular minister, from that particular minister, was absolutely. Only people like Zisi with a tremendous sense of overall direction of politics would be able to perform that function as a critic. So it's almost like the political feedback system, and you need to have that criticism to engage in the process. And it is in this sense that the Confucians always look at the ego ideal of the elites. The so-called ego ideal, I'll give you just one example. You obey the king, or you obey the father, not because the king and father had authority over you, but because you are involved in a mutual exaltation. You can criticize your father, criticize your king, not accepting the father or the king as they are. You criticize the king in terms of the king's ideal, so allow the king to become a true king, or allow the father to be a true father. So you criticize your father because you want your father to be truly fatherly in the sense of the prescriptions of what a father ought to be. So this is loving care of the father to be truly fatherly that I become involved in that criticism. That's true with the king. This sense of loyalty forces the king to accept a new vision about political leadership. The new vision is that leadership is, especially one occupies a much higher position, therefore the power of that influence to flow, leadership has to be involved in the sector of service. In other words, leadership is not simply a mechanism of control or authoritative control, but leadership in fact becomes a transformative act to allow the leader to become an engaged member in the service sector of the society. The term servant leader is precisely what Mencius considered as what the rulers ought to become. And he tried, through his moral idealism, to develop that particular vision. Now, on the surface, what we have in terms of the Mencian project is highly idealized and in a way unrealistic. But I want to simply remind you what actually happened in the text was a strong Mencian belief that if the basic human sentiments, the basic human feelings of sympathy are not totally lost, in other words, the human heart and mind is still functioning, human heart and mind is defined in terms of sensitivity, then there is still a salvific power inherent in the political structure. And how to appeal to that particular center becomes the main concern of the mentioned ideas of the engaged intellectual.